We are building a 12-factor app with Drupal. This is part 2 in our series, Building a 12-Factor App. Today, I'm talking about Factor 2, Dependency Management. What's up, Internet? Tom Friedoff here, Solutions Architect here at ActiveLamp. If you didn't catch my last video on Factor 1, go check it out. I walk you through how to set up a local development environment on Docker. Today, I'm picking up where we left off and continuing to build on top of that app that we started from Factor 1. Factor 2 states, explicitly declare and isolate dependencies. So what are your dependencies in a Drupal app? Well, if you're building a Drupal site, one of your dependencies is Drupal core. If you're using any contributed modules, those are also dependencies. Basically, you can think of a dependency as any code that you're not maintaining yourself. These dependencies you don't want in your working repository. Keep these out of your working repository. So how do you bring those dependencies into your app? That's what a dependency manager is for. I'm going to show you today how to use Composer and how to pull down Drupal core and any contributed modules that we want to use. One of the other benefits that you get with keeping your dependencies out of your working repository is that it makes upgrading your dependencies a piece of cake. Basically, if you want to update Drupal core, it's a matter of changing a version number in a composer.json file and then rerunning your build. Composer will bring down the dependency that you asked for and put it into its place where it's supposed to go. Only your custom code unique to your application should be in your repository. Let's jump back into a demo with that Drupal app that we started in the last video and start defining some dependencies with Composer.
All right, so here we are back in our 12-factor demo app that we started in the last video. And just as a reminder, if you want to go grab this off of GitHub, you can go to the ActiveLamp repository and grab it at 12-factor demo. Now I have added one commit since the last video, and so if we go take a look at that, essentially all I did was update to the latest Docker sync there and removed some settings that we no longer need due to the upgraded Docker sync. All right, so let's go ahead and boot this app up. And so if we head over to our terminal and type in make start, that'll actually start the stack up. And just to kind of remind you of what that command actually did is we have a make file over here that has the different commands that we can execute using the GNU make command. And so make start essentially executes this bundle exec docker sync start command. And so what that did over here is that started up our Docker stack with Docker sync. And so you can see we have 3 containers that started up here, the MariaDB container, the PHP container, and the Nginx container. There was also a sync container that was started as well called Drupal sync. And so all of that was covered in the first video. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, definitely go check out that first video because that's where we covered all this information. And just real quick, if I go into this Docker Compose file, you'll see there's where those containers are defined as well. All right, so in this video, we're going to introduce the Composer Dependency Manager in PHP. So if we hop over to our browser and type in Composer, you'll see the first link in Google is this dependency manager for PHP. And so this is how we're going to pull in our dependencies for Drupal. And so I was mentioning earlier, when you're building a Drupal site, Drupal core is actually a dependency. And so we're going to pull in Drupal core with Composer. Now, in the previous video, the way we were actually pulling in Drupal core was using this Drupal image from Docker Hub, and that included Drupal core in there. We're going to continue to use this image, but we're not going to use any of the code in that image. Now, you could just switch this over to a PHP image, but for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to keep this particular image and then just pull in our own code so that we're not tackling any Docker configuration in this video. We just want to mess with the Composer Dependency Manager with PHP. And so there's a Composer template that you can go use to do this. And so if you just Google for composer template Drupal, you'll see that there are some docs here to actually create a Drupal composer project. And so that's exactly what we're going to do in our code base. And so let's grab this command and we'll head back into our terminal here. Let's actually get to the correct directory. All right, and so right now, the way we have this directory structure set up on our local file system is in the source directory, we have this web directory, and inside that web directory, we have the profiles directory, which just has our custom code in it. So we need to pull our custom code out so that we can use the composer template here. And so our custom code lives in this active lamp directory. Let's, for now, grab that active lamp directory and move it out of the source directory. So we'll just say move web profiles active lamp, and let's move that up one directory, and then we're going to get rid of the source directory completely. All right, so now we can paste that composer command that we got from the composer template file. And instead of creating this project in a directory called sumdir, we're going to create this project in a directory called source. And so basically what this is doing is this is pulling out it's checking out the Drupal composer Drupal project template, and it's putting that into this source directory. Now with the composer template, you get quite a bit of functionality. This is probably a topic for another video. We really won't get into everything that this composer template gives you, but this README file is definitely worth checking out on the composer template for Drupal projects on GitHub. So let's see how far this has gotten. All right, so now we have a Drupal core in our source directory. So if we head back to our code editor now, this should have Drupal core in our code editor. And so like I was saying earlier, the dependencies or the files that you don't manage yourself, you don't want to have in your repository. And so let's see what actually is in our repository now. If we type in a git status, these are all the files that are going to get committed to our repository. Now, some of these files come from what's called the Drupal scaffold. And so if I go back over to this composer template for Drupal projects, the composer template uses something called the Drupal scaffold, which basically creates files like the index.php or the update.php file for you when you run composer update. And so if I click into this project here, this will tell us which files are provided by this scaffold. And so we can actually add these files to our git ignore file as well, so that we're not actually adding this to our composer our project repository. So let's go into the git ignore file here, and let's go down to the bottom, and we'll just say ignore scaffold files, and then let's paste that there, and then this, that, and that aren't file names, so we'll remove that. And so now let's go ahead and save this, and then look at see what our terminal looks like. See if it looks a little bit better. Okay, so there's fewer files that we're adding now, but these files are actually files that we do want to add in. Some of these are empty directories, like the modules directory and the themes directory. If we look in there, those are empty directories that we need to actually have in place so that Composer has a directory to place modules when it's when we're asking for a module dependency from Drupal.org. This active lamp directory right here, we need to actually move that into the profiles directory. So let's do that real quick. And so this is going to go inside the source web profiles directory. All right, and so now this looks like this can be ready to be committed. We're not going to commit it just yet. We're going to finish setting up our stack here. So now that we have the entire Drupal root inside the source directory, we actually need to update our Drupal, or excuse me, our Docker sync config files. And so let's go in there because before Docker sync was just syncing over the web profiles into the container, and so now we actually want to sync all of source into the container. And so I'm just going to delete that. So basically this whole directory is going to get synced in to the Docker container. And so let me go to our Docker Compose dev file. And so that sync container is going to be mounted in our PHP container here. We actually don't want it to be in HTML profiles anymore. We just want it to be at var dub. On the Docker Compose file, let's see, we are sharing a volume with the Nginx container. So we're sharing var dub HTML with the Nginx container. We actually need to have this say web now because the Composer template actually creates a web directory and not an HTML directory. So let's go ahead and change that real quick. I'm not going to change it in this Docker Compose.yaml file. I'm going to change it in the Docker Compose dev file because this is really for our dev environments. When we create these containers to be shippable containers that we can push to production, we'll spend a little bit more time on this Docker Compose YAML file. But for now, I'm just going to create the volume in the Docker Compose dev YAML file so that we at least have the volume set up in our dev environment. So let's, change this to Nginx and back this up like so. All right, so now in our Nginx container, we'll get the same mount that the PHP container has to that Drupal sync container that's created by Docker sync. All right, so that Composer template sets up the Drupal doc root in a web directory, and we previously had our Nginx server configured to look at the HTML directory. And so just if we go in here, we can see we're putting in a configuration file on the Nginx server that's coming from our config directory, nginx-site.conf. And so if I come in here, we have a root here specified as var www HTML. So we need to change this to web here so that it'll actually pick up the correct directory that we're syncing in. And that should be all that we need to do to get this stack working again. So I'm going to go back to the terminal and I'm going to stop this by hitting Control-C. And then I'm going to run make clean. This will basically clean out the containers and the volumes and let us start from a fresh slate. And now I can type in make start, and this will boot up the containers again from scratch, create the Docker sync container, and sync the files again. And once that's done, we should be able to hit the browser and see the latest version of Drupal that we pulled down with Composer. All right, so now that our stack is back up and fully booted, let's hit the browser and see if we can get Drupal to load. And just for review, the Nginx server is listening on port 7080. So let's hit that and see what happens. Open up a new tab here. We'll go to localhost and we'll go to 7080. And there we go. There's our Drupal install. We're running the 8.5.6 version of Drupal. And again, we are in that active LAMP profile. So it's picking up that profile that we put into that directory. And now we can install this as we did before. So one thing that the Drupal Composer template does for you is it puts your configuration sync directory outside of your files directory. And so you need to actually create this config sync directory. For now, what I'm going to do is create this manually. When you've got this on your web server, you want to make sure that the web server has access to be able to do this itself, but I'm just going to do this right now manually. So I'm going to go into this source directory and create a config directory. And then right now I'm just going to make it world readable, but really this should only be read and writable by your web server. And so now if I go back to the install screen, I should be able to hit try again, and there we go. So now I can actually install this, and so our credentials are Drupal, and this is on a server called MariaDB. All right, so there's our freshly installed site. And so just to show that it did install the profile, if I look for the 12-factor module that we created in video 1, it is in fact here. So here's where Composer really becomes a huge benefit when you're using the Composer template for Drupal. Is when you want to add new modules, all you have to do is just run a Composer require statement, and it will run out to Drupal and download that dependency, put it in your composer.json file, and place it in the correct spot in your Drupal install. And so let's go ahead and give that a shot. If I go back to our terminal here, I'm in the source directory of the code base. I can run composer require. Let's pull down the Drupal JSON API module. What this did is went out to Drupal.org and grabbed the latest version of the JSON API module, and it put it in our Drupal site. And so now if we go back to our code base and we go inside of our web directory and into our modules directory, into contrib, we can see there's the JSON API module. So let's verify that we actually see this in our code base. Let's go back to our terminal, and just to show you that when we add new files, the sync is automatically watching, and so that's synced over to our code base. So let's get into the site again, hit the refresh button here. If I type in JSON API, that should show up. And so there, in fact, it is. And so another benefit that we get with Composer as well is if we need to make version changes, it's real simple to make version changes because it's all handled in a manifest file called composer.json. And so let me go back to the code base and show you what that looks like. So in our source directory, we have a composer.json file that shows us all of our dependencies. And so most of these dependencies, actually pretty much all of the dependencies, came from the Composer template that we were looking at earlier. If we want to specify a specific version of Drupal, we can come over here and update this Drupal core version and put in whatever version we want. So if, for example, we wanted the latest version of 8.4, we can come in here and type in 8.4. If we wanted to require a specific version of 8.5, say for example we wanted 8.5.5, we can basically take away this tilde and then run the Composer update. So you can see here that it took Drupal 8.5.6 and moved it down to 8.5.5. And then the scaffolding that I was showing a little bit earlier downloaded the 8.5.5 versions of those files and put them in the correct spot. And so now if we go back into the Drupal site and then come under the reports, so the database is already updated for 8.5.6. So this isn't a really good example. Let's go ahead and repopulate that database just to so I can finish demonstrating that this did in fact work. Now again, if you're moving forward, this is likely not going to be an issue, but because there were likely schema changes going from 8.5.5 to 8.5.6, that's why this is likely happening. So let's try something here. Let me just delete the database so that we can reinstall this. I'm going to clear the stack. And then I'm going to do a docker volume ls. Do a docker volume ls and grep 12. Nope, that doesn't work. Let's do factor. There we go. I'm going to delete the data here. All right. Delete the container that's using that data, and then delete the data. And so now if we start this again, it'll recreate that MySQL database, and we should be able to install 8.5.5 from scratch. Let's see what happens. And there we go, there's 8.5.5. So as you can see, using a dependency manager makes managing your dependencies much easier than not doing it. If you weren't using a dependency manager, you would actually have to move those files in and out of where they're supposed to go manually. Also, one of the benefits that we get is all of these dependencies like the JSON API and Drupal core aren't actually going to be committed to your repository. So if we look at this repository, we can see the only things that are going to get committed are these files. We don't see the core, Drupal core, we don't see the JSON API module in there. It's just the files that we really need to manage. So let me go ahead and add those files to our repo. And push that up to our repo on GitHub.
As you can see, we've got a lean code base that we're managing in our repository, and we've got an easy way to pull in updated dependencies with Composer. Not only that, we've even specified our infrastructure as a dependency of our app. Your code needs something to run on, right? By executing a few commands, we're able to build our app and have it served by Docker containers that will eventually ship to production. That's all I've got for you today. If you liked this video, make sure to give us a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. See you next time.